Think I'm recording again. So let's just say welcome back. Last time I was here, I talked about one of the movies that I've been watching recently. And for that video, it was Everything Everywhere All at Once. But I've also been watching, for this particular topic, sorta, that I latched on to, two movies most clearly come into my head. The first one was Everything Everywhere All at Once. I already covered that. But the second of which was the movie Eternity, the more recent one. I would say it became less like mainstream than Everything Everywhere All at Once. Happens to be from the same A24 though. And for the Everywhere Everything All at Once video, I tried to be a little bit more scripted, but maybe that might have not been the best, the most sincere approach. I don't know. Like, I attempted to follow what I had written down more closely than ad lib. So for this episode here, I'm specifically trying to do the opposite. So, Eternity, as a movie, follows three central characters within it. There's Joanne, there is Luke, and there is Larry. So Joanne is the wife, the mother of the movie, and the person of the movie that has to go through the major conflict, being between the next two characters, Luke being her first love, the man that was her first husband and tragically died in the war, and they didn't get to live out their life. And then secondly is Luke, the man that she actually spent the rest of her life with. She had kids with, lived for 65 years with, married 65 years, and ultimately who she dies with. Hard to say. The movie starts with the death of Larry first, as Joanne, now that they're, who knows how old, 80, plan to attend a gender reveal party for their daughter, their granddaughter, or some other level of that step. And well, Larry sadly passes away during that, despite the fact that in that same, or maybe not in that same time, but in that time frame, Joanne was going through cancer. So her time was coming in to an end as well. But obviously they expected, it was unexpected for Larry to go before. And in this movie, the conflict is just that Luke, the first husband, has been waiting in the afterlife for Joanne for 65 years, deciding to not choose an eternity of himself for himself, because instead he was waiting until the day that Joanne returned. It happened to be 65 years after. And then when Larry ends up showing up first, doesn't know that, this man is her first husband, was just waiting the entire time. And he sort of assumes that, there won't be any objection. Joanne is going to go with him when she arrives as well. He actually plans to go into the eternity already and set things up for her. I mean, at the very least, it's not like he's expecting to not have her in his eternity. But right as he's about to go, he runs into Joanne. And that's when the actual conflict of the movie starts. They meet up and she has to decide, an possibly hard question between what she ends up wanting to live with for the rest of eternity, whether it'd be Luke or it'd be Larry. And the entire movie, Luke is basically presented as this perfect kind of idealized romance, and they just think that about him in that way in general, because I don't know, he's just that kind of guy. And then for Luke, not for Luke, for Larry, he's just not really that kind of person. Like, it's a recurring joke that, he grows on people rather than actually being initially likable. And so it's a fair concern about who is she gonna end up choosing. They both go on one date into one of their chosen afterlives to sort of play out what it might be like, to see if this kind of event might show why one might be more worth the other, I guess. And then later on, it's eventually revealed about the fact that Larry was planning on just leaving and going to his eternity, assuming that Joanne was going to decide to go to the same one as him. And ultimately, she decides to choose herself in this portion of the film. Like, it was an impossibly hard decision. So, no matter what, somebody would end up hurt, right? But what I would say is one of the first of many sacrifices that occurs in the movie is Larry realizing something about Joanne now that she's here. One of the defining features is that your current person, how you look, is directly taken from the time when you were most happiest. So if you were most happiest when you were a child, then when you went into that afterlife, you looked like a child. You were yourself when you were this age. So that's when you were most happiest. And before she ends up going to Paris land, the Paris eternity with her best friend, uh, he realizes that the appearance of Joanne isn't necessarily an appearance that he recognizes. Mostly it was the hair. She never wore her hair the way that she was wearing it now when they were together. Like, she specifically mentions that she cut it after Luke went to war, or after something before Larry, and that was basically the proof he needed that her most happiest day, her most happiest time, was ultimately with Luke and not with Larry. And so she ends up listening to Luke that tells her to go and be with Luke, be with the love that she didn't get to experience, but what was ultimately the happiest that she had been. Right? She could live out the, I'd say, live out the idolized or fantasy kind of dream outcome that she might have hoped for if it wasn't for, Luke's untimely death. And so Larry does that sign of love to ultimately give her up for her most happy. Like, he fully believed that she would be the happiest with him because that's how she presented herself. That's what the afterlife gave her as her afterlife image. And so she does. She goes with Luke and lives out her eternity with him for, I'm not really sure how long. But for very, I think immediately. I'm not sure how long. Time isn't super clearly labeled in this, but without taking much time at all, she starts to visit these archives. The archives being basically showcases of memory lane. Like, goes in there and can see moments of her past played out within like a theater area. Hard to say. But she goes in here to relive her moments with Larry. Like, despite the fact that she was here having not chosen to spend this time with Larry, she constantly continued to come back and, remind herself of the life that she had. She the original thought was that, choosing this afterlife with Luke was gonna be a perfect outcome for her and exactly what she should have wanted and had in some other life. Which is also why I relate this so much with the same previous movie of, everything everywhere all at once. Because ultimately has a lot of that same idea. Like, if it wasn't for the fact that Luke died, then the life that she was living out, I don't know how long he was in the afterlife for, but however long it was, it should have been the idealized afterlife where she got to live with her first husband, her first love, and the happiest she ever was. But ultimately, that isn't the case. In the same way that in Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, the realization is, or like the quote in that one that I mentioned before, is that even in the successful universe, the one where they got to live out all their dreams, or they lived their most successful lives, in another life you would have still really liked to do just laundry and taxes with Evelyn. And then in this one, the realization comes to Joanne that even though this was supposed to be the love she never got to experience, ultimately what mattered most was the actual life that she built throughout the years and the life that she shared with with Larry. And it didn't matter that it wasn't no perfect. As she does this realization and she still also goes through the bad parts of it. But maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit, tiny bit. Ultimately, I do still also like to call out that both of the husbands end up performing the same kind of ultimate sacrifice, I would say. The same way that Larry gave up his chance for Joanne because he realized her happiest was with him. Luke ultimately decides to help Joanne get out of their eternity together in order for her to escape and be with Larry. And similarly, the third sacrifice being the one that Joanne is doing right at that moment, because she ultimately doesn't know what actually happens if you leave in eternity. You're strictly not allowed to try and leave your eternity and go to another. You become a sort of fugitive, and there's this thing called the void. That isn't strictly explained what it is, but despite the uncertainty that she might be stuck in what would be the closest representation to hell that the movie shares. She still does it. She loves Luke enough that she does that very frightening decision to confront whatever might be on the other side of that door if it meant being with him and finding him. And so the part that I mean with the bad moments too is that when she does walk through those doors, she goes into some completely different sort of subspace, not fully explained. And I actually didn't watch any analysis videos for this one, so this is really how I'm taking it. But it just ends up being like the unfiltered version of her life, because the archives place mostly showed the ideal moments. It showed like when she goes into the shared version with Luke, she only sees, how they met, the most important parts, like their marriage, them ultimately saying goodbye, which I guess isn't like the happiest one. But it ultimately doesn't show everything completely. Like in the individual archives that she watches, she sees portions of her later life, including the last one she shares with Larry before, ultimately his passing in that situation. I guess I wasn't going to get ahead of myself. That is technically the portion I wanted to mention. Well, yeah, just that the last memory that she stays hung up on before the final decision to leave that singular afterlife is just the memory that they start the movie with, of them being old together and traveling to this baby shower and ultimately just bickering in the car. That's another kind of moment I like to mention, bickering in the car. And well, that's only one small, negative-ish moment. But when she actually goes through that door, the archives being this filtered image of her memories, the actual behind the door seems to be a more truthful, unfiltered version of all those events. It starts with her actual childhood trauma, which is that's the only time that it's referenced, and I don't know what's going on in it, but it seemed important. But it's not important enough for the movie to actually cover it. So, you know. Well, ultimately, then it moves on into more of the present life of her. He sees her own like deathbed as one of these moments in this unfiltered memories. And well, then the moment I'm trying to call out is the fact that she also goes and walks into one of her memories. And like these are true like real life sets, like she walks through the apartment as if she's really in it, while in the archives it's just as if it's them standing on top of a theater play with pretend backdrops of said moments. But here she's physically stepping through this room that she recognizes and hearing the fighting between her and Larry in the background. And the fight itself doesn't really matter, I don't think. Like, if you want to be technical, though, it was about the earlier moment mentioned that I don't know if it was the mother or the father just doesn't like him, but she tries to reassure him that it's just that he grows on people rather than just being initially likable. Whatever. But point is that it's an argument, so she was choosing Larry despite the good or the bad. Like, that's an example of the bad. And yet she was doing this. She was going into this dangerous situation that she nearly got captured in just to stay with Larry. And ultimately, luckily, Larry, on the other end, was not necessarily waiting for Joanne, but just he said that his reasoning for not having gone to the beach eternity, which was the eternity that he had in mind, was because sand really reaches everywhere. But I generally like to believe that if the real-ish reasoning is just that an eternity wouldn't have felt right after, having, as far as he knows, lost Joanne, and he'd have to spend eternity without her, and whoever knows where he would have gone. So he was ultimately replacing Luke in his bartender job, and that's where Joanne is able to find him. And they ultimately then run away together, going back into this sort of underneath the train station where there was this unfiltered reality memory lane. I don't quite understand the full symbolism. Like, why is it specifically that they have to crawl through underneath the train station that drops them into the afterlife? I don't know that part, but ultimately, the lesson is that the important part of love wasn't just your one happiest moment. It wasn't the idolized version that you thought this would be the biggest ideal, the one true happy ending. If I could have just been with this one person instead, for example. But instead, it was just about the history and the actual life that she lived, the real one that she had in front of her and in her life for the past 65 years. That was ultimately the actual the actual love that she wanted and got by the end of the movie. And I think it's a very moving moment of her realizing that choosing the the experiences, all the entire life that she lived, regardless of the good or the bad, he ultimately chooses the ordinary love, the ordinary love that she shared with Larry for 65 years. And there was also a couple moments throughout the movie that I specifically saved the quotes from. And honestly, I probably should have gone with them as I went by, but it's too late now. But that particular quote is mentioned as the great ordinary love. I actually don't know where this quote came from. It must have come from the movie because it's in quotes. But I do not remember it being said, or when it was said, or who said it. But it's the point that I'm trying to make. So let's pretend I remember. And just that it's the great ordinary love that ultimately wins in the end. That's the one that Joanne chooses and that they both end up getting to share. It's the laundry and taxes of this movie, kind of same themes. And the exact words that Joanne uses for her kind of justification is just that love isn't just one happy moment, but it's a million. It's, all these countless ordinary things. But where she specifically also quotes bickering in a car, since it is one of those moments that she clearly shares and remembers last about her time with Larry. And then, slightly less on topic, there was ultimately a couple moments, or two more quotes specifically, that always felt like important parts of what is said in the movie for me. Specifically, that throughout the beginning of the film, or like after they're all in the afterlife together, it's mentioned that from Karen, the friend of Joanne, that Larry ultimately made his life about making her happy. And even despite all this, like, the hard part about there being this other person that was trying to win Joanne over is that he doesn't really know why Joanne fell for him in the first place. I mean, the other quote being a line that Larry says directly to Luke: "You were the ghost I could never compete with." Like, even in his final moments, basically his family was comparing him to to Luke without. Obviously, he died, but they were looking at a picture of him, and the kids had to ask, like, why did you end up choosing Larry instead of this guy in this picture? And well, obviously, the simple answer is died, but that's not a nice answer, and I also don't think that's what they said. But ultimately, uh, Larry died himself right after that was being mentioned, so not a good outlook for him. But it's just another point about basically the expectation that memory is ultimately a memory. It's doesn't change, so you can't. It doesn't change. It doesn't make mistakes. It is ultimately the idealized version. Because honestly, you don't know how Joanne's life might have gone if she did marry Luke, if Luke had made it back to the war. All she can guess is what could have happened, but not what would have. This wasn't a multiverse story, so we don't get to see that part. I mean, technically, they don't do that in everywhere, everything either. But you know, but yeah. Ultimately, I lost the thread of that one. I don't know, but I thought that the comment that Larry had made his life about making her happy was impactful because I don't know. I think that I'm gonna kill this pig. So there you go. It's just something to think about. He made his life about making her happy, and that's, I don't know, I guess all that he could really do. It probably wouldn't have been possible to, like I said, compete with a ghost. The just the thought of what could have been, or that there might have been something better out there. But ultimately, he just tried to do his best for Joanne, make her feel loved, and he did so for countless years, and that's ultimately what mattered most at the end of the film. That allowed Joanne to leave the afterlife that she could have had with what could have been like what is even still described as in the moment that she lives as the perfect guy, but instead goes with Larry. I think it's the most important part of the movie. Clearly it is, but it just speaks very deeply to me in magnitude of levels. I don't know. that was basically my thoughts on the movie Eternity. Basically, just unrelated. But these two films called out to me the most during this time. And so I felt like I had to pick out the important parts and think about them more clearly. I don't know if I do a good job of that here. At the very least, though, I hope this makes for a good conversation and something good to think about. I don't really know if I have any other topic to make for another video. I had the hiking, everything, and this one planned out in my head, like at the same time. They came all at the same time. So we'll see. But I am still trying my best, even if that best can be rocky at times. I just hope that it can be seen that I am trying something here. Anyways, that is all. I'll hopefully see you again sometime soon.